Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the first event in the Spring 2020 series of the City Talks on the theme of changing memoryscapes in the city. My name is Ruben Rose-Redwood, and I'm an associate professor in the Geography Department at the University of Victoria, and also chair of the committee for the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, which puts on the City Talks. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, as well as acknowledge the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support of the Faculty of Social Sciences, as well as a variety of departments at UVic, including the Geography Department, History, Political Science, as well as the School of Environmental Studies and the Gustafson School of Business, which have all supported the City Talks this year. Now this year, in fact, marks the 10th anniversary of the City Talks lecture series. And if you're interested in supporting the series as either a donor or a co-sponsor, we encourage you to visit our website at citytalks.ca for more information. Now it's really my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Emma Renaerts, who is currently completing a Master's of Journalism degree at the University of British Columbia. As a journalist, Emma has covered a range of topics, including representation in the media, place naming and monuments, intersections of identity in the arts, and policy. Her work has been published or broadcast by the Tyee, This Magazine, and CBC Vancouver, among others. And tonight, Emma is going to be discussing her current research project about the removal of the John A. Macdonald statue here in Victoria, as well as a variety of other recent examples of changes to the commemorative landscape in a talk entitled Monumental Changes, Finding Meaning in Monuments and the Controversies Surrounding Them. So let's give Emma Renaerts a nice warm welcome to the City Talks.
Hi, thanks Ruben for that introduction and for inviting me to speak to everyone here tonight. I'm really excited to be here, only slightly nervous. I was just joking that I'm usually on the note-taking side of the room, so it's funny to be the one speaking like this. And I'm also glad that you did the land acknowledgement that you did. That was part of my notes for my introduction as well, just to acknowledge really that this is the traditional land of the Lekwungen-speaking people, which is especially important to me talking about the removal of a monument on Lekwungen land. And also to acknowledge for myself that I am white and a settler and exist on this space only because of a colonial legacy. I'd also like to say, so I'm a Master's of Journalism student at the UBC School of Journalism, and this is my last semester. And this project that I'm working on is sort of a fulfillment of what's called the final research project, which is half a work of journalism, in my case a long-form investigative piece about the removal of this monument, and also a literature review. And I'm interested in interrogating monuments and thinking about why they matter and the controversies that they stir up. I'm not interested in whole-scale discrediting them or issuing a broad declaration of their faults. So this is the main thing that I'm talking about, the removal of the John A. Macdonald statue from outside City Hall in Victoria, which occurred in August of 2018. And for me, this is both a really interesting case study of a much larger phenomenon, but also in itself a really important story to be looking into because of what it can teach us about monuments more broadly and their role in reconciliation in Canada. So the statue in Victoria was erected partly as an homage to his role in shaping Canada, and local figures felt that it was doubly important that his statue be erected here because he had once been the federal member of Parliament for Victoria. The story of Macdonald's election in Victoria is interesting because he never once visited the town during the time of his election, or his entire duration as its representative. And Canadian politics at that time was a very different ballgame. There's a really interesting piece on the Capital, which is a new news publication about sort of the more shady, underhanded dealings with sort of bribery and corruption and like the manufacturing of his election here. But nonetheless, despite this more dubious past, there were many local Victorians who cherished the memory of Macdonald's time as MP for Victoria. And so one of them was a man named James K. Nesbitt, who was a local historian and journalist. He referred to Macdonald in his writings as the #1 father of Canadian Confederation in a 1978 article in the Daily Colonist, which would later become the Times Colonist. And he wrote 2 articles in the Daily Colonist between 1978 and 1980, calling for a statue of Macdonald to be erected in some prominent position in Victoria. So, I'd like to see a bronze statue of Sir John somewhere in Victoria, he wrote in 1978. Surely there must be some rich conservative hereabouts who would do this, so that we all may know a little more about our exciting history, too much of which is wrapped up and hidden in closets. And Nesbitt was not alone. In his 1980 article on the matter, he crowed that Victoria's then Member of Parliament, Alan McKinnon, also supported his cause. He says, so McKinnon writes, "I too am an admirer of monuments, and believe that as Canadians we should have more of them." Nesbitt also reported that McKinnon was writing with a group called the Sir John McDonald Society to get a statue of Macdonald put up in Victoria. So I want to make this clear, there was still a hunger for the commemoration of Canada's first Prime Minister in the 1970s and 80s, which is just under 40 years ago. People were actively working towards the goal of seeing a statue in his honor erected in Victoria. We, myself included, often assume that these statues to colonials or to Confederates are vestiges of bygone eras. These are ancient relics, things of days gone by. But the statue of Sir John McDonald in Victoria was not installed until 1982. And this story is not unique. Many statues around Canada and the United States were erected in much more recent times than we would typically assume. And usually were put up in pushback to some social movement or change. So in the States, often it's in pushback to the civil rights movement. Someone wants to reassert dominance or power on these lands. So the bronze statue, which stood outside City Hall until August 2018, was designed by artist John Dan, who since its removal has been quite vocal online about his frustration with the removal. And it was paid for by the Sir John McDonald Society, which still exists to this day, although has very little online presence of any kind and is very hard to get in touch with. I've tried. The decision to install it, and in that location where it was outside the Pandora Street entrance to City Hall, was made by the then Victoria Mayor, Peter Pollan, and according to councillors and the mayor who I've spoken with, by Peter Pollan alone. So it was a fairly unilateral decision. So I guess it might not be news to many people in this room, but I think it's curious to ask why it was so controversial that his statue was celebrated in this city. And a large part of that is because of who he was and what he did. So Macdonald was portrayed as, and I think still is for some people, the gentle George Washington of Canada. He was a deal maker with Mother England, and despite flaws which were well documented, such as alcoholism and corruption, he was a person many admired for his successes in uniting Canada under Confederation in 1867, and for building a transcontinental railroad when it was considered impossible. But Canadians are not often taught, in schools at least, that Confederation was achieved on the backs of Indigenous people, whose culture he worked to destroy as Canada's longest-serving Indian Affairs agent, a position he held while also Prime Minister for about a decade, under which authority he pushed forward the Indian residential school system and the Department of Indian Affairs, which are the foundations of Canada's most genocidal and assimilationist policies concerning Indigenous peoples. Likewise, the project to construct the cross-country railroad was a success largely because Macdonald starved Indigenous peoples in the prairies in an attempt to force them to move to federal reserves further north and clear a path for the railway. So these are some headlines which demonstrate that a more complex understanding of McDonald is beginning to make an impact throughout the country. People call him the real architect of residential schools, or give lists about some of his sort of wrongdoings. And this has also resulted in change or protest around places where things are named for him or where his statue stands. So one of the best examples, other than the removal here, is that in Montreal, McDonald's statue has been spray painted red or symbolically covered in blood at least 4 times in the past 2 years. Also in 2017, the Ontario Public School Board voted to change the names of all schools bearing McDonald's name, but this vote was later overruled. And in Victoria, the case of the removal here was the second major statue removal of its kind in Canada, and also the first of a nationally significant figure, the first removal being of Cornwallis and Halifax. So the removal itself. This is mostly from first-person accounts from people I've spoken to. I live in Vancouver, so I wasn't here. But at 5 a.m. on August 11th, 2018, city workers in yellow vests and hard hats began to arrive at the Pandora Street entrance to City Hall. It was a cloudy morning in a small coastal city, and even at this early hour, a crowd was beginning to gather. The workers congregated around the statue of John A. McDonald. And as the sun began to break through the clouds, workers fastened ropes around McDonald's bronze neck, and as if he was being hung in public, lifted the figure off its base. And for one person who I spoke with later, this was a symbolic hanging of a man who made the decision to hang Louis Riel, the Métis leader. So this was a highly emotional moment for a lot of people for a number of different and complex reasons. And several supporters of the removal and also protesters against it were facing off on the day of the removal, as I'm sure many people in this room are aware. People were singing the Canadian anthem while wearing Canadian flags, trying to assert the connection between McDonald and a Canadian identity, which is proud of the history it feels this removal was trying to erase. And activists responded with their own chant, drowning out the sounds of this anthem. And by around 7:30 in the morning, the truck pulled away with the statue, which remains in storage to this day. And the decision about what will happen next is still kind of not really even at the front of the table for the city of Victoria. So the decision to remove the statue felt, I think, quite abrupt for folks living in Victoria at the time. Most people heard days before it was removed that there would be a vote, and then the vote occurred, and the decision to remove the statue happened within the next 3 or 4 days. So the vote was on a Thursday night, and it was removed on Saturday morning. And so a lot of the pushback to the removal was less about the fact that it had been removed, but about the fact that the public had no time to kind of come to grips with this reality, or to put in a word either way. But this decision was actually made quite intentionally by the mayor and council in conjunction with a group that they created in 2017 called the City Family, which was part of an effort for a larger effort within the city of Victoria for reconciliation with the local nations, and specifically working with the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. So the decision was made through like over a year probably, or around a year of conversation behind closed doors with a small group of representatives from the city as well as members of the 2 nations and urban Indigenous communities. And it was quite labored. I spoke to several people who were part of these conversations who all felt that they had to do something about the statue, but the decision to remove it was not an easy or a lightly made one. And it all came down to a feeling expressed by most of the Indigenous people in the room that this statue was deeply unsettling and disturbing and brought back quite painful memories or experiences or feelings, either from their own life experience or the experience of their elders. And so the decision was made, and then it was brought to a vote, and then very quickly it was removed. I also, in that, want to acknowledge that this is not just politics. It was not a procedural process, that this had really deep human involvement and impact. So this is a quote from a woman I spoke to named Florence Dick, who's a member of Songhees Nation and also now a member of the city family, although she wasn't at the time of the removal. But she, in her dealings at City Hall, had walked past the statue a number of times. Yeah, and for her, it was always an unsettling, uncomfortable feeling to walk past his gaze. And when I asked her, maybe a little bit naively, how long members of Songhees have known exactly what McDonald's legacy was, she said always. That they have always been aware, as long as he has been here, of what he has been a part of on this land. And the rest of us are just very slowly, or very quickly now, catching up to this knowledge that has been expressed for a long time in smaller circles. The desire for the removal of this statue happened in spaces other than this discussion group for a long time. And when it was raised in the discussion group, I'm told that it was a unanimous feeling amongst the Indigenous folks in the room that this was not something that they wanted to pass through, that it was distracting to go into a meeting after having walked past him and having to talk about reconciliation immediately after that encounter with this bronze figure who towers over you. So I just want to highlight that it's more than just the procedure, and it's more than just the politics, that this is like also about human impact. And then also that there's emotional impact on the other side, that monuments and statues mean something to people, and the controversies that erupt around them are because they connect with personal memories and feelings and stories within all of us, regardless of our connections to them. So part of what I'm trying to do with my research and with the piece that I'm writing is to look at what's happening now, what's happening in the years and weeks and months since this statue was removed. I feel there's a real gap in literature, and especially in media coverage, where monuments are concerned, that often the coverage is about the removal as an event. It has no beginning, middle, or end. It simply happens and then is over. And sometimes there's a follow-up that says, you know, we found the statue in this government building. Or there's a larger think piece about why this whole trend is happening at all. But an actual follow-up on what the removal of a specific monument has achieved, if anything, or changed, if anything, rarely ever occurs. And so I kind of wanted to find out what was happening. And at first I went in a little bit adversarially, perhaps thinking that nothing would happen, because I think often nothing happens. And I think Victoria is a bit of a different case. So this is the kind of coverage you normally see. It's on the day of. And there's a picture, they're almost identical, of a statue in ropes connected to a pulley. And that's about all that happens. So based on my understanding from stories that have been shared with me and conversations that I've had, reconciliation, at least for the Indigenous folks that I've spoken with, is not an event, is not a one and done action. It's a journey, it's a process, it's a lifestyle, it's never ending, and actions are required to show that change is happening, but they are not in themselves reconciliatory or reconciliation. And so I think Mayor Lisa Helps does understand this and is hearing this and trying to act on it, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But that's part of my interest in looking at the follow-through, is trying to find deeper reconciliation. So Macdonald's Victoria statue is joining, or has joined, a growing heap of discarded monuments to famous historical figures around the world. In 2015, the University of Cape Town removed a statue of the imperialist Cecil Rhodes, who was vastly enriched by African diamond mining, and unabashed in his opinion that, quote, "the native is to be treated as a child and denied the voting franchise," a belief which laid the foundations for apartheid a few decades later. And the removal came after a long and emotional Rhodes Must Fall campaign, led predominantly by Black South African students at the university. The same year, a movement to do away with US Confederate monuments gained traction, and by 2018, more than 100 of them had been plucked from their former places of pride. In Canada, the removal process has been slightly less violent, perhaps, than in America, but there is a concerted effort to erase discredited public symbols. So 5 months before Victoria uprooted Sir John McDonald, Halifax got rid of Edward Cornwallis, a former Nova Scotian governor who's credited predominantly with founding the city of Halifax, but who now is most famous for placing a bounty of 10 silver galleons on the heads of Mi'kmaq people, which are the local First Nations in Nova Scotia. And the statue's removal in Halifax, 87 years after it was erected, sparked protests and counter-protests like those seen in Victoria, with local right-wing groups and more moderate protesters bemoaning the statue's removal, and Indigenous people and their allies countering those sentiments. So monuments have, as I've said, an immense power to stir emotion. They are physical manifestations of values and beliefs, more than representations of a neutral past meant to educate. And the Unite the Right rally is a pretty perfect example of the power that these statues and the conversations about their removal can have. So on August 12th, 2017, almost exactly 1 year before Macdonald's statue would be removed in Victoria, the most shocking fight over Confederate monuments erupted in Charlottesville, Virginia, resulting in several injuries and the murder by car of 32-year-old Heather Heyer, who was a supporter of the removal. And after the Charlottesville City Council voted to remove the statue of Confederate war leader Robert E. Lee from the public park, small rallies started in February of that year, and then culminated in what became known as the Unite the Right rally in August, which was led by white nationalists and their supporters. And a state of emergency was actually declared because of these rallies. And the statue remains standing, which is quite interesting, and there's actually been a bit of a move to block all removal in this area because of the concerns they have about these kinds of protests. And I think it's pretty obvious but fair to say that the images from this event are stuck in a lot of people's minds, that this really made an impact and showed kind of horribly and violently, but on quite a large scale, how powerful statues can be. So why should we care? I think part of my interest in this has come from a background in memory studies, which started in my undergrad. And so I might indulge a little bit of my research knowledge from that background to talk about a guy named James E. Young. So he wrote about monuments and counter-monuments as they were emerging in Germany as they started to grapple with the project of memorialization after the Holocaust. And they were dealing with an immense problem of how to memorialize tragedy, whereas often monuments memorialize heroicism or victory. And so the traditional monument is this giant heroic symbol of success, and it tells you of a thing that is done, that is over, that in a way you don't have to engage with anymore. And obviously you couldn't do that for the Holocaust. And so artists and designers and different folks were grappling with this project. And so this is part of his critique of traditional monuments. It is as if once we assign monumental form to memory, we have to some degree divested ourselves of the obligation to remember. Instead of searing memory into public consciousness, conventional memorials seal memory off from awareness altogether. So his argument basically is that by telling us exactly what to think about something and packaging a narrative very cleanly and concisely, it gives us the freedom to kind of move on. We don't have to worry about memory or remembering it because the remembering has been done for us. The narrative has been packaged for us. There's no relationship or interaction. And I think I don't know, if you've been in a city with a lot of monuments and you walk around, you don't really engage with who they are or what they're supposed to be telling you or why they're there. They're just sort of there. And that normalizes and kind of covers over what they were intended to do politically and what they were trying to tell you. And so counter monuments, which were emerging in this memory project for Young, presented new hope for the potential to memorialize without shutting off memory. And so he says that counter monuments were conceived to challenge the very premise of the monument. And that the most important space of memory for these artists has not been that in the ground or above it, but the space between the memorial and the viewer, between the viewer and his own memory. So it was about the internal process of memory, basically. And they do this in a bunch of really abstract, sometimes hard to relate with ways. But it's a really interesting sort of theory. So rather than creating self-contained sites of memory, he says, detached from our daily lives, these artists would force both visitors and local citizens to look within themselves for memory. And he also, I think, quite presciently, he wrote this in 1999. He says that the status of monuments in the 20th century remains double-edged, fraught with an essential tension. Outside of those nations with totalitarian pasts, the public and governmental hunger for traditional self-aggrandizing monuments is matched only by the contemporary artist's skepticism of the monument. The state's need for monuments is acknowledged, even as the traditional forms and functions of monuments are increasingly challenged. And so he says, the monument has increasingly become the site of contested and competing meanings, more likely the site of cultural conflict than of shared national values and ideals. And I think that's pretty well reflected in the dynamics and the controversies around monuments today. So we need to care about statue removal, not just because they are contested and controversial, but because it is often ineffective at doing anything other than stirring up controversy and putting on a performance meant to appease the local minorities who most personally take issue with the statue under consideration. And the situation in Victoria has raised the same complex questions that are being asked around the world. Is monument removal the right thing to do? And if it is there a right or a wrong way to do it? I think the first question, is it right to remove a statue, can only be answered on a case-by-case basis. And as to whether there's a right or wrong way, I think there is definitely a wrong way. But exactly what the right way is also just depends on the specific context. What it should come down to is the community, putting the emphasis on the needs and wishes of those most deeply impacted by the statue and what it represents, or makes normal in their communities and nations. Mayor Lisa Helps told me, as she said, that it's much more about process than about one act. It's about how the act is carried out, why, and what is being done for the future improvement of relations and the health and success of people. And so in this respect, Victoria is doing something pretty special and unique. They've engaged in an ongoing reconciliation dialogue series. They have like a central part of their 5-year plan involves actions for reconciliation. And the city family, which was the seed that started the removal is an ongoing body that they are working actively right now to integrate in a way that cannot be changed into the policy of the city, so that with change of government it still has to continue in some way. Because right now, part of the reason the statue was able to be removed is that there's a very progressive city council and mayor, and that may not always be the case. And so they're trying to make sure that this has longevity beyond the current council and beyond the current members of the city family, who are free to stay as long as they want or to leave when it's necessary. Yeah, so much like mainstream news coverage of statue removal, which starts and ends with the event of removal, most cities treat the reconciliatory work of statue removal as a finite and self-contained action. The statue is removed as an act of reconciliation, usually because enough pressure has been applied from the outside to force their hand. And then the decision makers wash their hands and move on. The removal has solved the problem, they think, or they hope. Colonialism is over, just don't fact check that. It is performative reconciliation, often meant to appease a voter base. Or at the very least, they have deeply misunderstood the true meaning of reconciliation and think that the action is in fact enough in good faith. And so I think, as I've said, but I want to reiterate that Victoria, in treating this as a long-term process, is doing something quite different. So Halifax is a good counter-example of this, where initially they were in conversation with Mi'kmaq Nation to find a way to remove the statue, and then the nation became frustrated with how slow it was going and how the lack of seriousness they felt was being invested in the project, and they withdrew. And then all of the pressure came from outside, from community organizing, from protests, with Indigenous folks and allies working together. And eventually it was brought to a vote, and they voted on it, and it was removed. But to the best of my knowledge, I lived in Halifax for 4 years. I have friends who still live there. It hasn't been part of a concerted effort or process. It has really been like we did the thing that you were pushing us to do, and now we're stepping away from it and looking at the next thing. And the process of reconciliation in Halifax is much more slow going because of that. Yeah, I also think it's interesting in like the larger context of Canada and the way that reconciliation is or is not really happening on a national level. And so I think there is real potential within municipalities to make some of these things happen and to work on local connections, because it's a smaller group of people to deal with partly and work with and build relationship with, but also because the nation isn't really setting a very promising example right now. Yeah, those are my main remarks on Macdonald. I do also have some other things I've worked on the realm of memorialization and place naming and things that I can share, if that's of interest, but I can also move on to, okay. So this summer, part of my program is a practicum, and I spent 10 weeks as part of a fulfillment of that at the TIE, which is a small local independent online broadcast or publisher based in Victoria, but looking at regional coverage. And two of the projects that I was lucky enough to be able to dive into with one of the editors there, David Beers, were one on a series on place naming, which started with a kind of satirical, a little bit tongue-in-cheek look at some racist street names in Vancouver and the people who gave those streets their names and their less than ideal, quite messy, complicated pasts and the actions that they had taken while alive. And then looking at how Vancouver itself has created a naming policy and a naming committee and is working on the project of naming new streets as they emerge, but is still dealing with the question of when to rename and how, which is pretty interesting. The main thing I learned is that it's really, really the word they used was anguishing to name, that there's such a complex process and so many stakeholders involved, and so many diverse communities, especially in a city like Vancouver, or even in Victoria as well, to try to balance all the pressure to have representation and to not step on any toes. But part of the problem that they're having is that new streets are only being created fairly infrequently, and they're usually small laneways or kind of off in the suburbs. They're not central, and a lot of the main thoroughfares in Vancouver are named for prominent like colonial figures from the past, because most of the names in Vancouver were named in the span of about 10 years by the same person. And then Justin McElroy from CBC Vancouver also published a great thing recently about, he does like a statistical breakdown of all the place names in Vancouver, street names in Vancouver, and that the vast majority, unshockingly, are of white people, and an even vaster majority are of men. And sort of that there's a larger problem of representation than just the bad names as well, that it doesn't represent the city or the people who live in it. And then the other thing that was kind of fun that I did, I think, so there's a public elementary school in Vancouver which is now called L'École Bilingue, which literally translates to bilingual school. And it's a French immersion. And before 1977, it used to be named after Cecil Rhodes, who is the imperialist partly responsible for the formation of apartheid in South Africa. I don't know why his name ended up in Vancouver, other than that he was significant to the British in some way. And obviously is the namesake of the Rhodes Scholarship as well. But it was on a public school. My dad went to that public school, actually. They never learned anything about who he was. And then the name was changed in 1977 when it became a French immersion school. But a nameplate that said Cecil Rhodes Elementary remained at the entryway to the school for a long time. And in 2017, the school was torn down and completely rebuilt for seismic upgrades because it was 100 and something years old. But the people at the school decided, without thinking, to keep the nameplate and reinstall it on the wall near the playground area. And when I called, I had a conversation with my editor, and we were like, it's kind of weird that this name is here still, or at all. Why is it here? How did it end up here? I called the school and I talked to the principal, and she admitted that she had done no research into who he was or his background. And that basically the only reason people cared to keep the name was for the alumni of the school, because people had gone to the school when it had this other name, and they wanted to maintain that connection. And even within the VSB, I spoke with one of the school board trustees, and he didn't know who Cecil Rhodes was really or what he had done, and I told him and asked him again if he would support the removal or what he thought about it being on the school grounds, and he still felt that it should stay. And it was quite shocking to see. I think that was a really good example, which also happened in Victoria with the statue of Macdonald, of how normalized these things become, how unpolitical people see them to be, that these really become neutral landmarks that are just there and have always been there and need to keep being there because it's history, without questioning the complexity of history and who's making the history and why the history matters, or who else it impacts. And then what I learned in the process of digging further into this story was that the parents at the school had already asked for its removal, that they were frustrated by the enduring existence of this name on the place where their kids play every day, where there was no education about who he was whatsoever within the curriculum at the school, either to appreciate or problematize him as a historical figure. And so I wrote this article, which is titled, "Why One School Keeps a Special Place for a Father of Apartheid," because I thought it was particularly interesting that even after a complete demolition of the building, this nameplate was kept. And it's quite big. It's kind of like a tiled, it used to be a floor entryway at the top of the staircase, so it was quite big. And I wrote this, and I had quotes from these people that I really couldn't believe they said on record to me about how little they cared about the history of this man. And then within a few days, I found out that there would be a vote by the BSB over whether to remove this nameplate. And it was spearheaded by one of the trustees named Jennifer Reddy, who is quite progressive and is a woman of color and like very much connected to these communities. And it wasn't even her riding, like her school, but the PAC had reached out again and re-expressed, in light of this story, how much they didn't want this figure to be celebrated in this way in their school. And it wasn't so much that they had a problem with acknowledging the old name of the school at all, but that this was not the right way to do it. So one of the other options that they had had within the school to maintain some of the heritage was to save banisters or other pieces of the old building and reintegrate them in new ways, or to have an infographic inside the school telling you about its history and telling you about the namesake and giving a more complex background into this figure. And instead, it was sort of just pulled out and plunked back with very little thought. And so it ended up being voted on and it was removed. And there was sort of discussion. I don't entirely know where all the pieces have ended up. I don't really know where all the tile is going to go. There's been conversations about repurposing it in other ways. But they also then changed policy within the school that naming from now on, like they are working on more efficient naming policies within the school because of the kind of parental concern expressed around this issue. And I was told by a lot of people that this was within my first year of journalism. And I was told by a lot of people that most people wait a decade, if not longer, to see this kind of real change so quickly from a story. And it was quite an interesting experience because then I also, of course, got a lot of pushback and some lovely online comments. And especially I think I'm wary because I was so much calling into question the need for this nameplate at all. I think it also gave the impression that I just wanted all nameplates gone or all bad people to not have any presence in the landscape at all, and I think it's much more complicated than that. But I also think fundamentally it should come down to the people who are most intimately affected by these issues. So one of the main people who took up the issue of the roads nameplate in the aftermath is, I'm going to forget her name, but she's a local activist who works on sort of issues around African Canadian experience and identity. And for her, this was a really important issue to raise in the midst of a lot of other issues around race and Black students in the Vancouver School Board specifically. There's been a lot of incidents lately on that topic, and that this was one more example of a system not looking at the people most deeply impacted by these kinds of unquestioned remnants of the past, and very straightforward celebrations without any kind of engagement with the other side of the history. So it's just a very interesting case, fun story. I don't know, it felt really cool to see real change. And I think for me, like, this is an ongoing project. I wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on monuments in one way or another, and this is something that I feel is a really good confluence of politics, society, and culture, where there's so many different, it seems so simple, and there are definitely times that it is not the most important thing to focus on when real lives are at risk, or when policy much more damaging than these memorials is in question. But I also think they're such powerful representatives or representations of often unquestioned values. And as we are starting our long journey of reconciliation in Canada, they are being called more into question, and I think that's right. And then I think the way that it will play out in different contexts needs to be different in those contexts. But it's also a joy and a privilege to be able to dive into them a little more and to speak about it with you tonight. So thank you.
So we do have plenty of time for questions.
What led you to be interested in monuments in particular?
Yeah, I can credit that with a professor I had in my undergrad. So I did my undergrad in Halifax at King's College, which is a tiny liberal arts school. And professors have a lot of free rein to teach things that they care about. So I took a course in third year called Memory and Late Modernity. And we basically explored memory studies and kind of the monument and the political meaning of memory and the different ways that it's used by the state to assert narrative or to create history or those kinds of things. And so I wrote a paper in that class that then became the kind of seed of my undergrad thesis, and then have just kept finding myself in that realm. And when I mentioned it at the TIE, I sort of hadn't considered fusing journalism with that interest until my editor at the TIE, I told him, I was like, I'm also kind of weirdly interested in memorialization, and he was also immediately interested in having that conversation and finding a way to cover it. So the local kind of examination of how it plays out started for me this summer, but it's been a long, weird interest that most people kind of just like react to. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, who was the professor?
Dr. Sarah Clift, yeah, who also, I think in Canada is Nancy's translator. If that means anything to
The questions, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about an argument that I've heard. I don't necessarily know if I agree with the argument or not, but it was by a friend who's, she's like really well, I guess she's really well educated in art history, and she spent a lot of time in Germany. And when they were renaming all these streets, like in Canada, well, in Ottawa where I'm from, she sort of posted this thing on Facebook basically saying that she had an issue with it because she spent a lot of time in Germany. And I wasn't thinking about this question until you mentioned Germany. I remembered her argument, which is basically like, in Germany, they still have a lot of these Nazi monuments from the war, and I'm not like you. I guess I'm asking you, like maybe you have a better. You probably know how they're remembering this, but
Right.
She said, you know, if you're changing all the streets from something, then you're just cherry picking what happened in the past, and you're not remembering like the horrible things that happened. And I'm not saying like I agree with this argument, but I've heard this argument. I don't know if you've heard this argument. And yeah, anyways, maybe you have some more insight as to like what they did in Germany.
Yeah, I'm not so specifically the German context. I just read an article recently, it's pretty old, I think, in the Atlantic, that was why there are no Nazi memorials in Germany, so it's funny that maybe there are.
This is just what I heard.
No, yeah.
But, yeah.
I mean, there's definitely like remnants of that past there, but I think the argument around like cherry picking what gets shared or what gets changed or creating then a revisionist sense of history or whatever gets repeated a lot, and definitely in the context of statue removal as well as name changes. And I think, I mean, what I've heard and what I've talked with a lot of folks about, including Ruben, is that in some way those names were also cherry picking history, right? Like that those names were also placed there by people for a specific, usually political reason. And also another part of the counter argument maybe is that like the removal of Macdonald's statue is maybe too easy, but Macdonald will not be forgotten because his statue isn't outside City Hall. You know, like he's still in textbooks, he's still like ingrained in the history of this nation. It's just questioning how we remember him, or changing how we remember him, and remembering him in a less glorifying way. And I think that's more what it gets down to. But it's definitely an interesting, that's a question, or a comment I've heard a lot, for sure.
Yeah, I've done some research on street naming as well, and in Germany, one of the first things that when the Americans came in, when the Nazi regime fell, was they stripped Hitler's name off all the streets that had been named after him, right? So that actually was one of the first, and you see that very commonly with regime changes, right?
Sure.
The fall of the Soviet Union, independence movements in Africa and elsewhere, where kind of the names from the previous regime get wiped away, and so that's actually quite a common practice, and sometimes certain names are leftovers that don't end up changing for various reasons. But I think one thing that I know we've talked about is the difference between remembering and honoring, right? And kind of honorific naming, or putting up a statue is kind of also honoring that figure, right? It's not just remembering them. And I know John Lutz and I have had some discussions about that. We had a little debate on Czech News a few months back about what does a monument actually do? Like, is it just a marker to remember what happened, or is it honoring that figure by putting them up on a pedestal? Right? And so those are some of the debates that.
And also, if the aesthetics are the same as another honorific monument, does it matter what the intention is, right? Like, if you never engage with the plaque or the history of the installation of a monument, does it matter what they were trying to do if it looks the same as all the others, right?
Thanks for your presentation. It's been awesome. Given the specifics of Sir John A. here in town, what do you think would be a good way of moving forward as far as what to do with the statue, and how do we engage better conversation in his whole memory to teach us some of the bad as well as the good?
Right. I mean, I think that's a huge question, right? And I don't think I can fully answer it myself. I think what's going on a little bit maybe more behind closed doors in Victoria right now, it's not, from what I've gathered, the priority or the main focus of what they're doing in the city right now to figure out where the statue will go. But I know that they do want to take that process pretty seriously, and that there will be future discussions both with the public and especially with the people who are most important in this conversation, or some of the more clear stakeholders, and especially the local Indigenous nations, right? But I think, that's the question that's kind of unfolding everywhere now that all the statues have come down, is that most of them are still in storage everywhere. And I think there's a lot of demand from what I've heard in public spaces that the politicians maybe don't have much pressing need to do anything else with them in the short term, but people feel it as kind of an open wound in a way, that you've removed this and stirred up all this tension and something else needs to happen. And so in Victoria they did put up a plaque right where the statue used to be, which is better than leaving a complete void. But also, it's is it public art of a different kind? Is it a counter monument? Is it placing that statue in a different place or in a different context? I don't really know. But it is, I think, something that people are starting to realize is there is the question of whether you remove it at all, and then once you do, what do you do next? It's really, with the physical statue, it's hard to know.
Thank you for the talk. I'd like to know if you had a chance to speak, if he's still alive or she's alive, the artist of the statue.
Right.
The person who made it. So, that person is still alive, or do you find
Yeah, he is.
them?
No, yeah. Sorry, I was going to mention that and then I totally forgot. So John Dan is the artist who made the statue. And he has published, I didn't speak with him personally, but he's published quite a lot following the removal. He wrote a piece for the Globe and Mail, and that piece was picked up in a bunch of other publications, and he's been on radio and talking about his feelings. And his main takeaway, I can find more of it, I have it, but he basically was very frustrated that it had been removed. He did not argue that Macdonald has a problematic past and has done, things that have deeply hurt Indigenous people in Canada, but he didn't believe or didn't agree that removing the statue was the best way to deal with this. And so I didn't speak with him directly, but that it's pretty well publicized that that's how he feels. Yeah, he says, he also argues that the piece was conceived without a pedestal, and that the choice to include a pedestal was made by someone else. So it would have been more human height rather than several feet higher in his original design. He also argues that it was placed in a more enclosed space than he had imagined, which facilitated more intimacy with it. And he argues, right, and this is his opinion, that it did not, this is a quote, "It did not aggrandize the man, but was a reflection of his humanity, on our shared humanity, with all its strengths, weaknesses, confidence, and insecurities." And then he goes on to say, "If tearing down my sculpture is the best way to move forward, then I'm all for it. But I cannot believe that any rational person who has reflected on our history can really think that removing about 150 kilos of bronze from view is going to change our history or help us understand it better." And that's a pretty common argument. Like, not many people are outright denying what Macdonald has done. But I also think it's missing the point that this isn't about changing history. This is about acknowledging the harm that the statue does to Indigenous people who have to pass it on their way into City Hall, or did, before it was removed. And that was why it was removed by the City of Victoria. It wasn't about trying to change history or understanding it better. It was a really simple motivation and a fairly simple action in their eyes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that statues are often installed kind of as a counter movement or a power move. I'm wondering, since this was installed in 1982, and you said that it was strictly the mayor's decision as opposed to council, and there was this John A. group, are you aware of any kind of, maybe, like, is this a representative of a local pushback here at that time that you're aware of?
Not that I know of. I haven't seen anything. I was trying to find, I found those articles from the 70s and 80s calling for the installation, but I couldn't find anything on the day it was installed or any kind of public response to it at the time documented. I'm still kind of looking, but I mean, I was also going to note, I think at some point, that 1982 feels really recent, but then also that the last residential school in Canada didn't close until 1996 in Saskatchewan, and so this was recent, and so was everything else, right? Like, and is ongoing, right? So, but I don't know of any specific thing that this was pushing back to, other than maybe a feeling that modernization was happening in a way that people didn't like, or that he wasn't being accurately remembered, and folks have been pushing for his memorialization for a long time.
Thanks for that very thoughtful presentation. I guess I have two questions. The first one is, given that sometimes statues should be removed, I mean, nobody would disagree that Hitler statue should be removed, or you suggested that maybe the City of Victoria, the way they removed it was not perhaps an effective way. Anyway, I guess my question is, you were suggesting maybe that every situation is different, but would there have been a better way for the city of Victoria to proceed in terms of, or any city, when they're considering removing the statue? What kind of process would you suggest urban space with?
Right. I don't think I said that. I think maybe the one thing that didn't necessarily go super well in terms of public reception was how quickly it was announced and then removed, and so folks felt discomforted by that, or unsettled or unhappy with that decision and the way it was carried out. I personally, having spoken with a lot of the people who were involved in that decision quite closely in the city family, understand why they did it. They had some pretty good reasons for doing it so quickly, namely that they were trying to contain the amount of time that there would be public outrage and vitriol, which would largely be directed at Indigenous people. And then also making it a city decision and a vote rather than a declaration by the mayor or the city family in conjunction with Songhees and the Esquimalt Nation meant that almost all of the hate mail was going to the city and the city representatives rather than to the wider group of people involved. Yeah, I actually think the process that Victoria went through was a pretty great example, maybe, but it's hard, right? Because in trying to center the experiences and the needs of the people who are most deeply harmed by these things, it will necessarily come across as a disregard for other groups and other opinions and people who have stake in that decision in whatever way. But I also think that's the lesser harm. So
I guess I would say that the feeling in Victoria among a lot of people was that it was too hastily done. There wasn't enough time for civic input. And we may agree with removing this statue, but in a democracy, I think we expect our civic government to have open and transparent debates around these kind of issues. And we might agree with this one, but the next one we might not agree with. And if these things happen kind of, like say dark at night or before dawn in the morning, to me that's a worrisome precedent.
Right. I don't know that democracy has ever put Indigenous people first, right? It's a colonial system and a colonial government, and I think that it also wasn't an overnight decision. It was a really long, complex conversation that happened behind closed doors, but with a lot of different people. I think it was maybe not perfect, but and it's not finished, and what happens next still matters, and people still need to be held to account, and things still need to be done in the right ways, and every context is different, but I think it was done with the best of intentions to cause the least harm to the people who were most at risk. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at the University of Victoria, and I study monuments, and in particular Confederate monuments in the States. But also note that this monument, much like many Confederate monuments, wasn't put up democratically. There was no vote, there was no civic discussion or input. It was individual, often the mayor or another individual and a small group of donors who put this together and put it through. So in many cases, there is a double precedent here where you're asking for a democracy and a civic discussion now, when in the past that was also not had. So we have to, in some ways, redress these past grievances as well as they've come forward and built up into the present, which I think is what the conciliation discussions with the city firm are trying to address.
I think there was a hand over there.
Thank you. I'm an urban planner, and I'm actually focused on arts and culture. I find this highly fascinating. So when the removal happened, there was actually a First Nations elder that spoke on media, and he said, in his opinion, it should be kept,
Right.
just because you can't erase her story, not his story. And then that being said, my father, who's also an urban planner, originally from India. He's 95, actually just turned 96. And in his opinion as a public, as an urban planner, and he said it should be kept, but have an addition of a plaque with all the atrocities. Which is interesting, speaking to two elders, because we know Bombay at one time was Bombay, but now it's Mumbai. So across the world, we're changing the landscapes, the streetscapes, and etc. I myself am actually writing and speaking about how do we decolonize whiteness in our public spaces. And it's really about the planners, the politicians, and the people that need to come together. I'm hoping and talking about a new planning paradigm, which is cultural based planning. And it's also dismantling white privilege within our municipalities. So who are the voices and what faces are designing monuments and art and architecture and artifacts in our public spaces? Now that's a deeper question of an urban planning reality. If we're honest enough and courageous enough to have those uncomfortable conversations, I'm an urban planner of color. So I will look at streetscape neighborhoods very different than my counterpart who's a white European urban planner. Where are the answers? Really, it's how are municipalities inviting in Indigenous, Black, and people of color artists and communities? Are they doing that? If not, which is what I'm working on, how do we create those bridges that are non-tokenized by inviting everyone to walk over to create memory? Because I thought to myself, I'm born in Victoria. I look around, there's no representation of myself. And I know my friends are Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and they walk around our urban landscapes. So even the word memory, whose memory are we talking about? It's the memory of white European peoples. I'm really fascinated, and I'm going to work towards this, is let's create memories that should be there. So for future generations, they can look up, down, all around, and gaze and see themselves being represented in the foundations, the walls, and in our monuments. And that's where change is going to happen. But we have to talk about white privilege. We have to talk about decolonizing the mindset before we can actually decolonize our public spaces. And those are very complex, contentious, and courageous layers that we actually have to unpack together. So it's highly fascinating. There's definitely work to be done. But it's really now letting white European art monuments step aside and let Indigenous, Black, and people of color artists and communities come in, and let's create some new urban landscapes. And then that's where the changes are going to happen, especially with diverse generations, the next generation and the next generation.
Yeah, it sounds like a really worthwhile project. And I think that is, I mean, the discussion around how, if the monument should be removed, speaking about Macdonald here, or if a plaque explaining his more complex history should be added, those all came up in the conversations leading up to the decision. And I don't think they were ever all unanimous until the end, and I think it was a really long, they went in circular conversation about what way would most benefit and most impact the people who were calling for this change. And then I also think, yeah, like that's part of why I'm asking what's next, what's after, what's happening, is that it is like the removal is still like a negation or a negative. It's a removal, it's not an addition, right? And so it is also about how do we add more complexity to the landscape and more nuance to the story, because that's the problem that most people have with monuments, is that there's no complexity or diversity in the story they put up about who is here and who's from here and who made here, you know? And so I think we're also still, like monuments and place naming, as Ruben said, has like changes and removals and renamings have been going on for basically as long as people have been like building and putting things up. But I also think we're in a very different phase of that process now, all over the world, where it is this grappling with these complex colonial histories. And I think, yeah, the larger, but it's still early days, right? So the first project is removing some of the places that maybe need to be removed, or reconsidering the things that are already up, and maybe in tandem with that there needs to be a bigger push for the addition of new monuments as well. But yeah, it's definitely super complicated.
There was a really interesting comment about the difference between remembering and honoring.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you had any insight into the Canadian $10 bill that was changed.
Right.
And I don't know if it happened very recently, but if you had any insight into how that process came about as well, and if it happened in kind of a quick or difficult process.
I don't know a ton about the decision making behind that. I think it was like there were nominations and there was some kind of a vote, like it was kind of a public input process. But the first decision was that there needed to be a woman on money who wasn't the queen. Yeah, at all. And then like the decision about who that would be took some time, I think. Yeah, I mean, and that's a kind of interesting, like the issue of representation and the different ways that we memorialize and honor is like in every part of our daily lives, right? And so money is also one of those.
Can I answer the story about a local activist here? So Myrna Forster started a petition to change, she's a Victoria women's historian, started a petition to get women on Canadian currency about 5 or maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And it had an online petition, but I think about 60 or 70,000 signatures, and nothing had changed, of course, until the Trudeau government got elected. And when that government got elected, they committed to this, and they struck a committee of half a dozen people, including Myrna, who nominated, I think 10 women who might be on the bill, and it was ultimately up to the minister to decide, or I guess not the minister, but the head of the Treasury Board to decide which particular woman will be first on the bill, but I think they have plans for it.
I had a question. You mentioned we're kind of in a new, like these sorts of issues have been going on for a long time, but we're kind of in a new phase of that. And I guess I was wondering what you think has kind of sparked this new phase. So, for instance, in the United States, the kind of massacre at the church in Charleston in 2015, I think it was, kind of led to the Confederate flag coming down from the State House in South Carolina, and then like a broader kind of movement to remove Confederate symbols in the United States, and then especially following Charlottesville, that led to another wave. Do you think in Canada it's primarily like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's kind of led to a broader, within the settler population, kind of a sense that we need to take these things seriously? Or do you think there's something else going on? I mean, I'm sure it's not an easy question to answer, but the fact, like for instance, at UVic, when I first came to UVic in 2010 or so, there was an effort to rename the Trutch building on campus, and that was rejected at the time in about 2010 or 11 or so. And then when that issue came back after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had put out the report, then the university was more receptive for various reasons to that petition, and they ended up renaming the building. So, I mean, just in that one example, it's kind of like a before and after, and the thing in the middle is the Truth and Reconciliation report, along with a whole number of other things as well. I don't know more and other things, but yeah, I don't know. What do you think in the Canadian context has led to this new kind of wave of considering these issues?
I mean, I think TRC has definitely played a big role in the way Canadians look, or settler Canadians look at Indigenous Canadian relations and dynamics, and justice and those kinds of things. I think it's within the TRC recommendations there are points on memorialization and partly the creation of a memorialization about residential schools, but also like thinking about that more in the Canadian landscape, and then I think even more in the UNDRIP, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there's kind of pretty clear recommendations in a lot of different categories around the issue of memorialization and commemoration. And then I also think the world is so much more global and interconnected. Like globalization is a real impact, and the internet. And,
so do you think
I have
the Canadians thinking about the U.S. and what's going on there in South Africa with the Roseman's Fall movement and all of that. I mean, so they're looking at these sorts of issues going on around the world and in the U.S. and elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think a little bit also there are people in a lot of communities who have been working for more nuanced kind of discussions about these figures for a long time, who can then draw on the momentum of this kind of global movement as it builds, and so they're all kind of piggybacking on the power and impact of each other a little bit too. Someone who I spoke to about the removal of the Macdonald statue, who's kind of like a local activist and Métis man, he was saying that when the statue came down in Victoria, he felt that they were answering the East Coast removal on this coast, that there's a dialogue and a kind of we're following you into this, or we're taking up the torch, or for some folks that's kind of the sentiment I think that is also part of it, like you did it, we can do it, or you did it, now we also have to do it to kind of prove that we're on the same page, or to continue that momentum. Yeah. But I also think, I think part of what's different, and I don't know why, is that there aren't really regime changes in the way there used to be. At least in Canada and the States, there have been political party changes back and forth throughout the time that this is happening. But it's not a complete, the Americans aren't necessarily all trying to erase all American history that has come before when they come in, it's a different, it's more the education is growing and the awareness is changing, and then that spreads. One place critically analyzes their history and another starts to do the same. And I don't know if they're doing it because of each other or it's kind of in the air, Yeah.
I have time for one or two more questions.
Thank you for your talk. It's really interesting, and I think I had a question. I guess what you thought of kind of the chronology of memory and how I suppose right now, I guess what the effect that the absence of a monument has in juxtaposition to the presence of the monument, and also the existence of the John A. McDonald statue sort of is within, a timeline where its relevance to maybe a certain group of people brought it into existence. But it's hard to imagine that with its absence, that in another 50 years, whether or not there'll be people saying, hey, remember John A. McDonald, father of the Confederation, should we put up a statue somewhere of Sir John A. McDonald? Or do you think that will actually just kind of be lost to time, and there'll be new people, from, a different from, the century to come or the decades to come that people will look to in that place? So do you think it really is just part of a particular point in history that we will just pass regardless of whether the statue exists, or do you think it will sustain as a point of interest?
I mean, I think that partly depends on what decision the city makes about the future of the statue, because it's still up in the air, and if it's, a lot of people call for removed statues to be put up in museums, which causes all sort of like curatorial issues and display issues, but is an interesting idea. So I don't exactly know where it will go, but I also, sorry, I'm trying to like, it's a really interesting question I'm trying to think about. I had an answer and I lost it. Part of what I'm interested in, I'm still in school, and so I'm still reading a lot, and one of the things I read recently for a course is Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith, who's a Maori woman and a scholar, and she has this whole sort of 9-point takedown of the Western conception of history, which is really interesting and worth reading. But part of it is the questioning of the sort of model of a linear chronological history as this thing that just sort of happens in sequence and will continue and sort of just is in and of itself, and like history is a human-made thing. So it partly depends who's writing the history later and in what way. And then, yeah, I also have the question about like whether there will be someone else instead. Like Macdonald's kind of a funny figure to talk about that with, because he will always be the first Prime Minister of Canada, and that's like a pretty significant moment right now. But depending on how Canada evolves, or like it could all totally change. So it's kind of a funny question to think about, but it's really interesting. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, let's thank Emma for coming to Just a reminder, so the next talk of the series is on February 20th. City Councillor in the City of New Westminster, Nadine Nakagawa, who was involved in the removal of the Begbie statue in New Westminster a year or so ago, will be talking on memories in stone confronting colonial monuments. So hopefully some of you can make it to the next talk. So anyway, have a good weekend, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.